Hello and welcome to Trails Worth Hiking, the show that brings you some of the most interesting backpacking and trekking routes in the world. I'm your host, Jeremy Pendry. In the first part of the show, we bring you the story and history of a trail. Then we tell you what it's like to hike the trail and how you can do it. On this episode, we will tackle what is often considered one of the most difficult treks in the world, as we head back to the Himalayas for an epic multi-week adventure that has stunning beauty and high mountain passes. But no, we are not going back to Nepal just yet. This time we are going to be culturally immersed in a remote country that measures its gross national happiness rather than simply GDP, as we travel the Snowman Trek in the South Asian kingdom of Bhutan. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. I'm publishing this episode in July 2025. 5 years ago, in July 2020, I started this podcast during the dark days of the pandemic. So happy birthday to Trails Worth Hiking. I realized at the time that the history podcasts I loved were a bit abstract, and the hiking podcasts I listened to were missing history. So I decided to put them together in one podcast where you'd have a practical guide to a trail, but also have the history and context and stories relevant to the trail. And here we are 5 years later. Thanks to all of you for coming along with me on this ride. The podcast has reached 179 countries and territories and more than 11,350 different cities. Seattle, Washington is currently the top city downloading the podcast, so thanks to Seattle. And overall, I'm proud that so many of you have actually gone out and hiked these trails after being inspired by the show. So please keep doing it, and I'll keep making episodes. Before we jump into today's episode, I want to thank our longtime sponsor, Outdoor Herbivore. Early on in the podcast, I had recently switched to a plant-based diet and was looking for quality backpacking meals that would satisfy me on the trail. I found Outdoor Herbivore and really loved their meals from the first time I tried them. They eventually sponsored the show and have been with the show now for quite a while. I still swear by Outdoor Herbivore, and they are the only dinners I eat on the trail. I still really love some of the meals that I had tried early on, like the chickpea sesame ziti and the naked freckle burrito. But I've also grown to enjoy their breakfasts, like the toasted sunburst muesli and the high elevation rice cereal, as well as some of the cold soaked meals, like the hop pea slop. So if you want to give Outdoor Herbivore a try, we have a discount code TWH10P, Trails Worth Hiking 10%, for Trails Worth Hiking listeners to get 10% off of their order at Outdoor Herbivore. So thanks again to Outdoor Herbivore for sponsoring the show. On this episode, our guest is Jonty Crane. Jonty is a listener, blogger, and more than anything, an adventurer who has done a lot of trekking. He has a blog called Jonty Travels, which you can check out. As I said, we're going back to the Himalayas. The Himalayas are a vast and culturally diverse place. There are endless treks in the region that are worth doing. We've covered several treks in Nepal, plus a trek in the Kashmir region, but this is our first time in Bhutan. Bhutan is a landlocked country on the southern slopes of the eastern Himalayas, sandwiched between China and India. It has a little over 725,000 people, so it's much smaller in population than the other countries in the region. Bhutan is a democratic constitutional monarchy, which means it has a king as its head of state, but also has a prime minister as the head of its government. It also has what they call the Je Khenpo, which is the head of the state religion, which is the Vajrayana branch of Buddhism. The English word Bhutan means the end of Tibet, as in the end of the Tibetan Plateau, which is where Bhutan is located. But that is only the name of the country used in correspondence in English. Its official name is Druk Yul, which means the land of the thunder dragon, which is a reference to its dominant Buddhist sect. I dare you to find a cooler name for a country than Land of the Thunder Dragon. People have been in the Bhutan area as early as 2000 BC, but its quasi-modern history starts in the 8th century AD, when Buddhism was introduced and became the dominant religion in Bhutan. Bhutan has never been colonized, it's never been occupied or governed by an outside power. The current monarchy lineage, though, is actually fairly recent, having been established in the early 20th century. For a few hundred years before that, there was a theocratic Buddhist government. The monarchy is the House of Wangchuck. The king is also known as the Druk Gyalpo, or the Dragon King, of course. Dzongkha, or Bhutanese, is the national language, which is a language of the Tibetan language family. But instruction in schools is given in English in Bhutan. For any of you who have heard of Bhutan, it's likely to be for one reason: the concept of gross national happiness. This is the idea that what is really important to measure in a country is not simply economic activity or development as measured through gross domestic product, but rather the more important metric of success is the collective happiness and well-being of its people. This concept of gross national happiness was introduced in 1972 by the fourth king of the House of Wangchuck, when it was declared more important than GDP. The idea drew upon Buddhist concepts of compassion and non-harming of others. So I think it's worth it to explain what Bhutan thinks of as the parameters around gross national happiness, because we can all learn from this. There are 4 pillars of gross national happiness: sustainable and equitable socio-economic development, environmental conservation, preservation and promotion of culture, and good government. Okay, so those are the pillars, but there are also 9 domains for determining a country's gross national happiness. The 9 domains are psychological well-being, health, time use, education, cultural diversity and resilience, good governance, community vitality, ecological diversity and resilience, and living standards. Bhutan actually has a Gross National Happiness Commission responsible for implementing the plan to determine and improve gross national happiness. They first conducted a survey of their gross national happiness in 2008, and there have been additional surveys since then. I do want to note that there have been some accusations that gross national happiness has been used as propaganda and to distract from government abuse of certain ethnic minorities. But as always, I'm not going to wade into that controversy. I think there's a lot for us to learn from the idea of gross national happiness, despite how some may perceive its origins. In any event, in 2011, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution urging member nations to follow the example of Bhutan in measuring happiness. The following year, in 2012, the UN issued the first World Happiness Report. All that said, a 2019 World Happiness Report ranked Bhutan 95th out of 156 countries. So measuring gross national happiness doesn't necessarily mean you'll end up at the top. But we all know the saying, you can't fix what you don't measure. So I still applaud Bhutan for popularizing the concept and trying to improve its own happiness, regardless of how it ranks according to the UN in comparison to other countries. So that's the idea of gross national happiness, a really innovative concept that came from Bhutan. Let's talk about the animal and plant life in Bhutan, particularly in the Himalayan region of Bhutan, rather than in the area closer to India that's more low-lying and flat. In the Himalayas, Bhutan has snow leopards, blue sheep, marmots, the Tibetan wolf, antelope, musk deer, and the national animal, the takin, which is a large type of wild goat-like animal that is related to the muskox. There are myths that the animal arose as essentially a goat's head on a cow's body. So that gives you some idea of how big this goat-like animal is. With respect to plant life, forest covers 71% of the country, which is an increase from 1990. Yep, it has more forests now than it did 35 years ago, which is pretty cool. The government owns the forested lands and is active in conservation and maintaining biodiversity. In fact, Bhutan is one of only 3 carbon-negative countries in the world. Suriname and Panama are the other two, by the way. So its forests absorb more CO2 than the country emits. The Snowman Trek itself is along a route that was originally a vital north-south route connecting communities in the Himalayas. Also, it was originally strategically important for defense. In the 17th century, when they were threatened by Mongol and Tibetan invaders, the route that is today the Snowman Trek was used to move troops. Tourism in Bhutan was only allowed in 1974, so it only became a route for trekkers after that. One note about tourism, though, there is no mountaineering allowed in Bhutan. Peaks are considered sacred, but there's also concern over not having the resources to rescue hikers if issues come up. So there is simply no mountain climbing in Bhutan, and trekking is really the outdoor tourist activity. The Snowman Trek goes through the remote Lunana region, where the Lunaps live, which are a semi-nomadic people known for yak herding. The trek is called the Snowman Trek due to the many snow-covered high mountain passes. So you kind of have to be a snowman, so to speak, to be able to do the route. Though some say it could also be a reference to the Yeti, said to inhabit the area. So who knows? The Snowman Trek is the longest hiking trail in Bhutan at around 340 kilometers. So around 211 miles, which is basically the same length as the John Muir Trail here in California. All right, so there's a little background. With that, let's jump into my conversation with Jonty Crane about his hike on the Snowman Trek. Jonty Crane, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
So, Jonty, you are quite a traveler, and you actually have a blog called Jonty Travels. Can you talk a little bit about the traveling you do and what the blog is about?
So the blog's been going for about 10 years as a bit of a personal diary for myself, and then some other people have started following along. And I think some of the places I've been to, like Syria and Pakistan and Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste, are a bit off the beaten track. So that's kind of where some people find the blog. And there's a lot of, I'm a big hiker, and so there's a lot of hiking content on there. And particularly my accent will give me away as a POM. So I grew up in the UK, but I moved to New Zealand in 2010. And so there's a lot on there about New Zealand hiking. I've done some ranking of what I think my favorite kind of multi-day walks are and day walks are. And I've done all the great walks. So it's a good kind of resource for anybody interested in hiking in New Zealand.
How did you learn about going to hike in Bhutan and in particular the Snowman Trek?
It's one of those things you're sitting at Google and, I wonder what the hardest hikes in the world are. It seems to be a common question that springs to mind. And I think also I did the Kokoda track in Papua New Guinea, and that often comes out as on these lists as one of the hardest hikes in the world. I mean, it's not, but it makes the list. And on this list was a trek called the Snowman Trek in Bhutan. And I was like, oh, well, I don't really know much about Bhutan, and I don't know anything about this trek. And so I started going down the rabbit hole of being on the internet and finding more out about it. And it's like, oh, this looks like a very interesting country and a very interesting hike to do.
So this says a lot about you. Most people actually probably aren't on the internet searching for the hardest trek in the world to do.
Slightly masochistic. Because the thing is, on the internet, obviously, there's a lot of information. There's that trade-off between finding hikes, which there's lots of information and they're very popular. So I know you talked about like the Kepler track, which is one of the great walks in New Zealand. And it's an amazing walk, but it is popular. So by comparator, the Snowman Trek, from what I can understand, gets between maybe 50 and 100 people a year complete the Snowman Trek. To put that in comparison, Mount Everest, 800 people summit Mount Everest annually. So it struck me as something which was quite obscure and not many people do it, but it is very doable to do. There's some hikes which you look at and you just go, actually, that's logistically too difficult or for various reasons. But the Snowman looked like an achievable goal, but one that not many other people have done.
Okay, so those are all good reasons to do it. Were there other reasons beside it being really difficult and sort of interesting because it's not that well traveled?
There's two really good things about the hike. One is the hike itself, and the second thing is the country of Bhutan. And Bhutan's a fascinating country.
Sure.
It's about the same size as Switzerland, but only has a population of about 800,000 people. If you're thinking about your geography, of the Himalaya. So it's just to the north of kind of India, south of Tibet, sandwiched along that Himalayan, just I guess south of the Himalayan kind of plateau. So it's got some quite big mountains along there. And Bhutan's just a very interesting country. It's very unique. Most people think about this concept of gross national happiness, which was, I think, developed in the 70s in Bhutan. And whenever I read stuff about Bhutan, it's a bit cliched now that it's all about gross national happiness, and people don't. And it's like, no, people still care about development and having jobs and having money. But the government did introduce this measure to think about people's well-being. And it's a Buddhist country. There's lots of beautiful Buddhist temples. And they've done a lot to preserve the culture. So if you want to go into a zong, which is like a fortress, which is half, it's interesting. From the outside, it's a fortress. And then on the inside, half of it is like your local government office. So if you want to do anything administrative, you go into the front half of the fortress. And then the back half of the fortress is generally a Buddhist temple. So you've got this interesting combination between the government and religion. Obviously, you can't really imagine that in, like, say, the US, in terms of having your local government offices and your church combined. But that's how it kind of works there. And they're very beautiful buildings. And for anybody entering those local, they have to wear their traditional dress. So you still see a lot of people wearing traditional clothing. And then the building facades, they've got very strict planning rules. So the facades of the buildings are beautiful. They all have to be done in traditional style. There's a lot of hand painting. It takes some years to train to do it. So there was the hike itself, but also the opportunity to visit Bhutan was a real selling point for me.
And so what did you do to go about planning this trek? Was it really about trying to find the right company to do the trek, to be the guide service for you?
Yeah. So to be in Bhutan, you have to have a guide with you at all times. And they have this, it's effectively a tourist tax, which is $100 a day. And then on top of that, you pay for your accommodation and your guide and various other things. But that money is a important part of the Bhutanese economy, and it's put towards education and infrastructure and kind of good things. But because of that, it kind of reduces the number of people that go there, and it means you have to go on an organized tour. Like, even if you just went to go sightseeing in Bhutan and the festivals are a very popular attraction, you still need to go and have it organized through a tour company with a guide. And so, just doing it it was really just, as I say, trying to pick the right kind of company to go with. And in my case, I chose a company called The Mountain Company. So that's UK based. It's quite a boutique tour operator. And that's one of the things I like about it. The guy Roland who runs it, he's summited Mount Everest. He's been up Makalu. He's done a lot of the hikes himself, and he runs a very tight ship in terms of the operation. And so, there's probably only half a dozen companies that do it. And I was very happy I went with The Mountain Company. And I've been with them since, and I will go again with them. So that was, in some ways, it makes it a lot easier. Trying to research a hike yourself and do it independently can be a bit challenging, but this was, you pick a company, you pick an itinerary, and then you pay your money and away you go.
So for someone who's never been to Bhutan, you've mentioned that, it's in the Himalayas. We're talking big mountains here, but what do you see there? What does it look like? I mean, you've talked a little bit about the buildings, and that's certainly really interesting to think about. But as far as the landscape, what are you seeing? What does this place look like?
Lots of trees. So
okay.
Well, at least there's quite a contrast. So the southern edge of Bhutan is kind of joins onto India, and it's actually, I haven't visited, but it's quite hot and more kind of tropical. And then you go up into a very kind of temperate forest kind of landscape, which is a lot of the kind of middle part of the country. So Bhutan is, I think, the only carbon negative country in the world, because it's got a relatively small population and it's got a lot of trees, and it has all its power is hydroelectric. And that's one of the main parts of the economy, is selling hydroelectric power to India. And then when you get the northern part of the country, which is where the hike takes place, that's then really getting up into the mountains. And then you basically hiking along by the border with Tibet. So some of the mountains you'll see, basically the summit will mark the border between Tibet and Bhutan.
What about the animal life and things you might see along the way? I guess you're probably seeing a lot of people and villages and that kind of thing, or maybe some. What is that like? Are you going through different villages? Are you seeing, is there wildlife?
There's a bit of wildlife. I remember seeing quite a few crows. They're quite a common sight in the Himalaya. Like, not just a crow, but like a mass of crows, which was kind of interesting in of itself. The national animal is an animal called the takin, which is interesting, but not. It's quite rare, and the trek does actually take you through its breeding grounds, but at the wrong time of the year. There's quite a few yaks around, but not a huge amount of wildlife. There's no bugs that I came across, so that was good. No mozzies or anything like that to worry about, or sandflies. Villages, I mean, what you're kind of doing is you're going into very, very remote areas. So at the beginning, I should just note, this is like a month-long hike. So you get to see quite a lot of variety of landscapes in the hike. It's a long hike, 350k or something. So it does take the best part of a month. So you're starting off in the kind of temperate areas, and then you're basically climbing up and up and up. You're going over 13 passes over 4,000 meters. I think the highest pass is 5,500 meters. So you're getting up into real kind of alpine kind of terrain. And there is a few, so probably about from halfway through, there's the village of Laya, which is the largest village on the way. And that is, 500 people or something, maybe 1,000 at max. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not a big place. You are going through some smaller villages, but you could easily go, particularly when you get to the last kind of third of the hike through the Lorana region, only people up there are yak herders. So it's like You could go days before finding a settlement, and you might see these kind of piles of rocks with a tarpaulin over the top. And then there's some very hardy yak herders who take their animals up there for grazing and make this yak butter, which is yak butter cheese, which is very acquired taste. It's a sort of cheese that lasts for years. Very solid kind of cheese. And so that's one of the attractions, I think, of the trek, is you're going to very, very remote areas, and you are camping, and you're completely self-sufficient amongst your team. It's quite different to even hiking in Nepal. I went out to Kanchenjunga, to the eastern Nepal, which is relatively remote compared to like Annapurna or Tibet or Everest. But it is there was a lot more villages and settlements there, just because there's more people live in the country and it's more kind of accessible.
So this is a camping trip from beginning to end, where your crew is setting up tents every night along the way.
Correct. Yeah. Interesting. So in Nepal, often they use, and a lot of other places in the world, you use people as porters to carry your gear. In Bhutan, everything's carried by the horses or yaks. So yeah, the crew, they'll pack up the site and they'll move on and then set up camps. You just walk from kind of campsite to campsite, really. But these campsites are middle of nowhere, which is really part of the attraction to me.
Were you the only one on this tour, or were you with a group of people?
No, I was with a group. So it is possible to do it. Again, you need a guide and you need a support crew. So we did come across towards the end of it I think an American couple who are honeymooning on the Snowman Trek, and they had decided to do it in less time, and they looked exhausted because they were having to do some long days and you're at altitude. So you could, I guess, privately organize it, but very few people would do that. As I say, most of it would be through a tour company. So there's the Mountain Company. There's a few operators in the US and Australia, like Himalayan exhibitions. There's Mountain Madness, World Exhibitions, KE. They all kind of run this trip, and then they organize kind of all the logistics from that. But you have to know, actually, they do have slightly different itineraries. So the Mountain Company is the only one that does a slightly longer route through Lorana region, which is more scenic. I haven't done the other route, but I've looked at photos of both, and it is definitely more scenic. And some of the scenic highlights were in the last kind of quarter of the hike, but it makes the hike a little bit longer. So I think that's one of the reasons why some of the other companies do a different way back, is it makes it a bit shorter and cheaper. But if you're going to spend that much time and money to go there, I'd really recommend doing the Mountain Company's kind of route, because it just got better and better. And that's kind of what you want when you're doing a big hike.
So talk a little bit about the season for this and the weather considerations, because I know that when you did this trek, there were some issues with the weather in the early stages of the hike.
Correct. So this is an interesting one because it's a very, very small window of opportunity. So the trek, as I said, is about a month to hike, and this is at the eastern end of the Himalaya. So you get the monsoon season, and that's really kind of over, I guess, Northern Hemisphere summer. So you don't want to start too early because it's going to be wet every day. But you've got to get over the high passes towards the end of your month hiking. As I say, they can be up to 5,500 meters above sea level. And those you will need to get through before the snow arrives. So there's this quite narrow window between end of monsoon season and the start of the snow, which would make the passes impassable. So the window they do it in now is kind of basically October.
Okay.
Now, when I did it, so I walked this in 2019. we walked a couple of weeks earlier. So I think mid to late September. And I think the monsoon was a bit late. So that's issues we had with weather. And it wasn't catastrophic. It just was for the first week or two, it was pretty kind of overcast. It would tend to rain, but after we got to camp, so kind of late afternoon or overnight, it would rain, but you didn't get to see the tops of the big mountains. And then a couple of weeks in, then it all kind of cleared up. You could see everything. It was stunning. So I think every year they take on feedback and adjustments. And so now and also with climate change, that's making quite a big difference to the timings of some of these treks they operate. So now they've pushed it back a couple of weeks. So it's really kind of October is your window of opportunity, but you need to appreciate I was hiking in Nepal in November and it was blue skies every day and it was clear visibility. Whereas Bhutan, just because of its location in the Himalaya, the weather can be a bit more variable.
Okay. That's good to understand. What about gear? What are you taking versus what the trekking company is providing? What do you need to bring to Bhutan with you? And then what are you actually carrying on the trail versus what they're going to provide?
So as I say, it's a supported hike. So they take the tents and all the food and a mess tent with chairs with backs on. Now, that's one thing if you're ever organizing a guide trip, is you want to make sure the operator has chairs with backs on. Because if you're sitting on a stool for a month after doing a day of hiking, you're going to get a very sore back. So that was definitely something that was appreciated. They take I'm not a coffee drinker, but they take a proper coffee machine. So for those who drink coffee, that's always appreciated. Yeah, pretty much everything. The only thing you need to bring is your sleeping bag, sleeping mattress. The gear says carried by horses or yaks. So you can take up to 18 kgs that they will carry. And so all your warm clothing and everything will go and kind of goes in those bags. And then you just carry a day pack for the day. The only specialist equipment really was micro spikes. I don't know if you've ever used those, but they're amazing. They're sort of a go-between, like a crampon light. And so they're spike things you put over your shoes, and they're really good in icy or snowy conditions, but they're a lot lighter and easier to use than crampons. So, but we didn't actually use them on the hike. I've used them on other hikes, but that was just kind of in case the snow came early. And obviously, as you're high up, the sun is quite bright. So you really want to be taking some decent category 4 sunglasses with you. Otherwise, yeah, everything else they kind of brought along. And they're I think all tour operators who do this kind of trek need to be, but the mountain company in particular, very strong on safety. So in terms of comprehensive first aid kits, you want multiple first aid kits in case the group gets split up, satellite phones. And the thing they bring with them and have used is, I call it the body bag. I think the technical name is a decompression bag or something. But basically what it is, if you get altitude sickness, that is an issue. And the only way to get out of altitude sickness really is to get down quickly from altitude. Now, when you're in a very remote part of effectively the Tibetan Himalayan kind of range, that is a challenge. So they have a bag which basically you can go inside and they pump it up and adjust the air pressure. It can make it so that your body is effectively 1,000 meters lower than the altitude you're at. So if I'm working in meters, you can convert to feet. But if I'm at 4,000 meters, it will drop it down to 3,000 meters. And that's a massive difference in terms of altitude issue.
Yeah, so that's about 3,300 foot drop.
Yeah, so that is really good. You've got to be careful with it because you can burst your eardrums if you change the air pressure too quickly.
Yeah.
But it is, I just spoke to a friend of mine today who I actually did the Snowman Trek with 6 years ago and I hadn't seen for 6 years. And I saw him this morning. He's a doctor who specializes in high altitude. And the last trek he did, somebody on the trip got altitude sickness and basically it saved her life.
Wow.
Because the weather wasn't good enough to get the helicopters out and you need to act quickly. So it's something to consider when you're thinking about doing any high altitude, particularly long. If you're doing the Inca Trail and you're up and down in a few days, fine. But if you're going to be out there for weeks on end, you want to make sure that the operator's got a really good safety record and has the right equipment and training.
Did you also bring Diamox or some other altitude medicine?
I did. I love Diamox. I swear by Diamox now. I've done altitude without Diamox and I've done it without Diamox. And now as soon as I get to start, even at 3,500 meters, I'll start taking the Diamox because it does make a material difference to your enjoyment of the hike. And it's better to take it before you need it than it is to take it after you need it.
Yeah.
So one of the things we do as part of these kind of safety features is every night after dinner, they would check your heart rate and also your blood oxygen rate. And if your blood oxygen is less than 85 to 90%, that's going to be cause issues. And so there was a guy on the hike who he wasn't taking Diamox. His blood oxygen was getting quite low. He started taking it within a day. His blood oxygen had gone up by 10-15%. You could see the difference it made. And so just a quarter or half a tablet in the morning and in the evening makes a big difference to these kind of things.
So I have a random question. Do you know why it's called the Snowman Trek? Is it simply because it's at high altitude and there's a lot of snow, or is there some other story for that?
I feel like there's probably some sort of Bhutanese legend about it.
Okay, let's go with that.
They're very into kind of myths and legends and yetis and things going on. And it is a national thing. So something that was interesting about Bhutan is they've got a monarchy. I think they're on to their 6th king, and they're very monarchistic. Like you'll see pictures and portraits of the kings throughout the country. And the snowman is something that the last king, I think the previous kings, they've actually walked themselves. Like it's something that's like a national kind of trail. And I think a lot of Bhutanese would have walked maybe parts of the Snowman Trek, maybe not the whole thing, but it is a thing. It also has a nickname as the Mudman Trail rather than the Snowman Trail. And I honestly think that's ill-deserved. Like it is muddy, but I've done a lot other, especially in New Zealand and in Uganda. I know you did a podcast on the Rwenzori Mountains of the Moon, which I did a few years ago. And you're walking in gumboots there or Wellington boots, like it is so you're walking through swamps and it's really muddy. So the snowman is, because of all the rainfall, particularly post-monsoon, it's a bit slippery, muddy, but it's not like you're going to lose your boot kind of muddy.
How do you get to Bhutan? My understanding is this is a pretty sketchy airport landing.
Yes. So I live in Wellington, New Zealand, and that is also sketchy. Like if you look at like most dangerous airports in the world, there's the one near Everest, and Paro in Bhutan comes up there. And honestly, Wellington, because of the wind, is also a bit scary sometimes. So the issue with Paro is there's basically a bunch of mountains in the way. It's a mountainous country. It's not the capital. That's Thimphu. So you go into Paro, and I think they can only land during daytime hours. And they basically kind of have to go around the mountain to come into land. So it's quite cool if you do like a YouTube of flights coming into Paro Airport. But I don't know of any safety issues that they've had there. But it's quite a cool place. I mean, it's like Queenstown in New Zealand as well. You come in, you turn right at this mountain, left at this mountain, and then you drop down in between. So, it's pretty safe these days. Now, there are 2 airlines. There's Druk Air and Bhutan Air. Mm-hmm. And you can only get to Bhutan from Thailand, India, Nepal, Dubai, or Singapore. So those are all, most of those are reasonable kind of hubs. I think I got there through Delhi, and I think that Delhi is one of the better routings because it goes along the Himalaya. Mm-hmm. So if you sit on you want to sit on the left side of the plane, I think if you're flying east towards Bhutan, I saw Mount Everest from the air. Like you get to see all the mountains in Nepal because you basically fly across Nepal to get into Bhutan. So when you're thinking about how you're going to get to Bhutan, it is worth looking at the airports and which side of the plane you're sat on, because it's pretty cool being able to fly along and see Everest and all the kind of mountains that you've Lhotse and Makalu and mountains that you've heard of, because they're pretty big.
How hard is it to get to the trailhead once you're in Bhutan? Is this something where you have a long transportation after you're there already?
The start's pretty close. Just get a transfer from Paro to the start. I off the top of my head, it was a few hours, if that. And then at the end of the trail, you sort of walk 2/3 of the way across the country to the east. Then it's a 2 to 3 day drive, a bus drive kind of back. But there's things to stop off on the way and see. So that was quite nice. You got a bit of culture as well as the travel. And I'd strongly recommend that you don't get off the plane in Paro and then start the Snowman Trek like that afternoon. Like you need a bit of time to acclimatize. It's unusually long time at altitude. That is probably one of the main reasons for the difficulty, is just the length of time that you're spending very high up. And that is tiring. And you want to make sure that, as I say, you don't want to have any medical issues. So the more acclimatization you can do, the better. So the itinerary, for example, that the mountain company do, you go and visit what's called the Tiger's Nest. Now, Tiger's Nest Monastery. So if you've ever seen any photographs of Bhutan, you've seen the Tiger's Nest Monastery.
Yep.
It's this temple monastery, which is like clinging to the side of the rocks, 1,000 meters up. Like it's very photogenic, and all itineraries that go to Bhutan visit that. So that you will do as part of your acclimatization. But then certainly our itinerary, we went to something called the Ha Valley, which is to the west of Paro. And that had some very nice walks as well. And you're just getting used to spending time at altitude. That just makes such a difference. You can take Diamox, but you can't really rush your acclimatization. You just need to spend some time up there to get used to it.
So you've mentioned this a little bit, but let's make sure we focus on it because I know people will have questions about this. It's $100 a day just to be a tourist in Bhutan on top of everything else, right? And then you also have the cost of the tour company. And this is a long trek. So I would imagine if you're doing just the Tiger's Nest walk or something, which could be a couple days, or some of the shorter treks in Bhutan, for a lot of people that might be more affordable. But what are we talking about in total to do a trek like this?
It's not cheap. Yeah, I think that one of the reasons for the low numbers, but because of that, you get a few people and you get a different kind of experience. So you're looking at somewhere. I had a quick look the other day at the kind of half a dozen companies that are advertising this, and the prices were anywhere between $11,000 and $17,000.
And that's for the tour company only, or does that include the $100 per day fee?
Oh, that's including the $100. So that's your complete package, basically everything in country, meals, accommodation, guides. And actually, I mean, the itinerary I did was 34 days.
Okay.
And I think the mountain company current price is $14,000.
Okay.
So 34 days. So it worked out, I don't know, $450, $500 a day, which was cheaper than doing the Renzuris in Uganda. It's cheaper than I went to Ethiopia. I've got a little track of how much all my trips cost per day. And so when you start averaging it out over a long period of time, it's expensive, but it's actually reasonable, I found, compared to some other trips you can do. To do a sort of similar equivalent hike in Nepal, it's probably a third of the price. It's quite noticeably more expensive, but it's a different experience. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting because if you ever meet a Bhutanese, they've never met a backpacker using the European use of the word backpacker, somebody who hasn't got much money and is traveling around on the budget and staying in hostels. To the Bhutanese, every visitor is super wealthy.
Right.
Because they have to be to visit Bhutan. So it's kind of, yeah. So yeah, it is, and obviously it is a thing and it is per day. So it is kind of cumulative. Some other popular hikes in Bhutan, there's the Dromlari circuit, the Dromlari Trek. So that's a 6-day and an 8-day hike. And then there's the 11-day Layagaza Trek. And they all basically follow the same sort of route out. So Dromlari is a pretty massive mountain, and so that's quite a popular place, and there's a base camp, you can stay there. And then Laya is the kind of the biggest village on the Snowman. So all those three treks all take the same route from Paro north, and then basically the circuit goes off a few days in, that turns into a circuit, and then you go out to Dromlari Trek, and then the Layagaza. So basically the Snowman Trek is the Layagaza plus another 20 days or so, or 15 days on top of
I see. Okay.
days. So the number, you will probably see more people in the early stages of the hike, but actually you don't tend to see that many at that time of year because of the monsoon. So you generally, it wasn't super busy, but certainly if you're going to see more people, you'll see people in those first kind of week or two, and then the last couple of weeks are really wilderness.
Okay, so it sounds like I would guess that the people who are doing the Jomolgari would be starting a little bit later because they're not going as far.
Correct.
They might start a little bit into October instead of late September.
Yeah, when we went to the Dromlari base camp, it was torrential rain and we couldn't see anything. And they're like, oh, there's a 6,500 meter mountain there. And you're like, well, I can't see anything. But then it's kind of cool. I think I don't know if it was Dromlari, another one, we camped up and they're saying, oh yeah, there's a massive mountain there. And you're like, okay, well, I can't see anything. And then in the morning, I got up and I opened the zip of my tent. And a bit of it was peeking out of the clouds. And then I was like, jumping out and get the camera and get photos. And then it disappeared again. And then later in the day, it kind of cleared up and you could see more of it. So it's almost more exciting when these things kind of appear and disappear out of the mist rather than just being able to see the whole thing straight up.
That's a positive attitude. So as far as the itinerary for the trip, we don't have to go through it day by day, but I'm just curious about how it develops over time. And I'm guessing it pretty much goes from low to high. Is that right? Is it you're starting, or is it pretty much high the whole way?
You're starting at 3,780 meters.
That's a pretty high start.
Yeah. And then you're camping out at 3,600, 4,000, 4,000, 4,000, 3,800, 4,000, 4,000, 4,000, 3,800. So you're camping a lot for that first couple of weeks around the 4,000 meter mark, which is what, 13,000 feet. You're quite high. And then what's unusual is often you start reasonably high, you carry on, you're going high, and the highest pass, which is actually 5,460 meters. You're not getting there until day 24 of your trip, which is probably about day 18 of the actual snowman hiking. So it's not until 2.5 weeks in that you get to the highest point, which is slightly unusual. Often you get up and you go over the high, and then you have a bit of a longer kind of down. But this is all basically high. I got a small cut on my finger, and it did not heal. It got worse. Like it was a minor thing. It was one of the things you just take a little nick, but because you're at altitude and your altitude so long, nothing heals. You just have to be quite careful, particularly around your hands, and obviously trying to avoid getting sick. Although I did get sick, and then I always view hiking at altitude as on average at least twice as hard as hiking lower down. A 4 or 5 hour day would feel more like an 8 or 10 hour day if you were hiking.
Right.
Yeah.
So what was the day-to-day routine like? How many hours are you hiking per day, and how does that work?
It was quite reasonable. So we generally wait at sunrise was around 6 a.m. Then you get some hot water and hot drinks if you want a coffee or a tea brought to your tent. Then you have breakfast at 7. So that would normally be porridge or cereal. And then you have toast, eggs, sausages and fruit. So the food it's amazing what they can do. The crew the mountain company use have been doing this trek for 13 years, 100% success rate. And so and they've got the same crew, like the same guys have been doing this every year. So they've really got this down to a fine-tuned kind of art. They've brought in a lot of dehydrated vegetables to help, because obviously you need a sort of balanced diet when you're hiking. It can be quite difficult to get that food out there. And out there, I mean, other than some yak, there's no food. Right? There's nothing really to eat. So you have to be entirely sort of self-sufficient and take food that's going to last for a long period of time. So they do wonders with the food. We generally start hiking around 8 in the morning. We'd have an hour for lunch between 12 noon and 1, and then we'd get to camp somewhere between 1:30 and 3:30. And we were quite a fast-paced group. I've done other hikes where you get in at 4 or 5 o'clock each day, it's a good hiking day, but it's quite tiring doing that day after day. So this was quite nice. You'd have a bit of a break. You'd have some drinks and hot drinks and snacks at 3:30, 4 o'clock, and then dinners at 6 o'clock. And then basically by 7:30, everybody's in bed. And then we repeated that 26 times. I think that's one of the things when I think about, is it one of the most difficult hikes in the world? It's one of them. It's definitely not easy, but I think anybody with a pretty good level of fitness can do it. I think the key obstacles, obviously, cost is a key challenge. The amount of time you need is a challenge. But I think really that, and the time spent at altitude. So probably the most difficult things for me was the time spent at altitude. It's just not good for your body. Mm-hmm. And also, interestingly, it was less of the physical challenge and more the mental challenge. I love hiking. There's something quite freeing about not having to think about anything. There's no internet reception. You're completely off the grid. And all you need to do each day is put your boots on and walk, and everything else is looked after. But when you do it for 26 days in a row, I found it quite hard. The first week or two is fine. Then you have this sort of the blues in week 3. And then the last week, you're kind of like, you're nearly done. So I think just psychologically, doing the same thing basically every day is one of the big challenges. There are 3 rest days. So pretty much you walk for a week, you get a day off, walk for a week, get a day off, walk for a week, get a day off. I had these kind of grand visions of going exploring around the village, and I did do a quick walk around Lyre, but after an hour or two's walking, I was wasted. I was quite happy just to get back to the tent and have a bit of a nap, and that was a good day for doing washing and just sorting out any admin. Mm-hmm. But yeah, just that. I haven't walked for 26 days straight before, and I don't know if I will do it again, but that was, that psychological challenge was, I suppose you could sort of expect it, but it's nothing you can really prepare yourself for. It just, just takes that amount of time.
For you, what were the highlights of this trip? What were as far as things you saw or places you went?
So right towards the end, or maybe 3/4 of the way through it, there's Lake Shoreham, and that is high up. That's going to be probably 4,000 meters plus lake. Is probably one of the highest places we camped out. 5,300 meters. That's where Lake Shoreham. Wow. So that's quite a high spot, and it's this just stunning blue lake, and it's surrounded by these mountains covered in snow, and there's not a soul about, there's no animals, there's no people, and we're camped out by the side of the lake, and the sun was setting and the colors were beautiful, and it was just spectacular. I'd say it was the coldest campsite. I think it got down to about -10 inside the tents, and it was the only place I've ever hiked where my water bottle froze inside my tent. So it was quite a cold night, but it was worth it. It was just, yeah. I've done hiking in quite a few places. I've hiked on 5 continents, sort of multi-day hikes, and done a few others at altitude. But to get this sense of wilderness, it's quite hard. Like hiking in Nepal, I've been there, and there's just villages and settlements in most places. Whereas here, you'd literally spend like a week or 10 days with basically nothing. And so that was really quite special, because you can do a lot of these guest house hikes or tea rooms, and it's to do a full-on wilderness camping hike. Yeah, that was really quite a special thing. I think just being in Bhutan and learning about the culture and history of the country was fascinating. That was a real kind of highlight for me. And I feel like I spent 34 days in the country. I feel like I've seen a reasonable amount of Bhutan to really kind of appreciate the country. And I think finishing it, I think there was a real sense of accomplishment. I mean, it wasn't mountaineering, but it was certainly quite a hard thing to do. And you sort of come away going, yeah, I've done the Snowman Trek. According to the internet, it's one of the hardest hikes in the world.
Anything happen that you didn't expect, or anything you would do differently that this time didn't, that you would advise others to do differently than you did, that didn't go as well for you as you had planned?
I do feel the cold, although interesting. I had my own tent. I think there were 3 people on the trip who had their own tents. So it was probably, I think, 11 or 12 of us. And then the others all shared tents. Now, the people sharing tents were quite warm enough. But if you didn't have another body in your tent, it was quite cold at night. So I took a hot water bottle, which was excellent. The crew also carried a few, and I ended up quite often having 3. I'd have one on my feet, one in my chest, and one on my legs or something. So it was quite useful. A hot water bottle, which the crew can fill up, is really good. Because you're finishing off around early afternoon. So you've got quite a lot of time in camp. I took a little sketchbook. That was good, because that was actually an unexpected challenge. Actually, the hike was charging devices. So I took solar charger with me, but particularly for the first couple of weeks, there wasn't a lot of sunshine. So it was actually always a bit challenging trying to keep your camera charged up. And because you're at altitude and it's cold, the camera battery dies sooner. There were a couple of villages, thankfully, where we could stop, and they had a bit of, I don't think it's not mains necessarily, but they might have some decent solar, and I could charge everything fully there. But certainly taking a decent battery pack and the solar charger, and just being conscious of that. And so having either sketchbook, others had packs of cards, things you can do that don't require devices, was quite beneficial. And then just in terms of the coldness, I had like 3 down jackets. My theory was, well, if I have 3 of them, then that will kind of bulk up and that will keep me warm in terms of layering. But actually what I needed, and what I've taken for subsequent trips, is a one very thick down jacket. And that made quite a difference. Oh, and actually you can get, I didn't have them on the Snowman, but I had them on other trips. You can get down booties. I don't know if you've seen these.
Yeah.
And they're amazing.
Fantastic.
Yeah, exactly. Because your hands and your feet are what are going to get cold. So really nice gloves and booties for your feet, that would make a big kind of difference.
I have to say, I really recommend people go to your blog, Jonty Travels, and check out the post you did about your sketches. It showed some of your sketches, because to me, that is so much more personal than a photograph. It really shows what your perspective at that moment was. And to me, that was really interesting to see. And they're quite good sketches as well.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Jonty, really appreciate you coming on the show to talk about your hike on the Snowman Trek. But while I've got you, I've got a few more questions, if you don't mind.
Yep.
All right. What is one piece of gear you don't leave home without?
An umbrella, which is an unusual hiking item. I think I learned off, there's an ultra light hiker. There's a few of them, but he's an ultra light hiker. The Trekking Life. He's done the Appalachian Trail multiple times. He's done everything.
Yeah.
And even though he's an ultra light hiker and he's carrying a pack like 5 kgs, which I can't understand, he still carries an umbrella. And so it's like, wow, maybe he's onto something there. So an umbrella for me, on the Snowman, I used it a reasonable amount for the rain. And so it's amazing. Obviously, you can wear you've got pack covers and you've got rain jackets, but you're still going to get wet and cold. Whereas just putting an umbrella up keeps 75, 80% of the rain off you. So it's fantastic when it rains. I remember doing Tour de Mont Blanc, and I got to one of the saddles, I think between France and Italy, and the heavens opened, and I saw all these people getting their ponchos out of their bag, and I just stuck my brolly up and carried on walking without caring the world, and I was completely dry and carried on. So very useful for rain. Obviously not so good if you're in the bush or if it's particularly windy, but generally, brolly's pretty good. And then for the sun, so I've just spent the last year living in Timor-Leste, which is a tropical country just the north of Australia, and it's very hot. And so actually I'd carry an umbrella with me always then. It's shade from the sun. That made quite a big difference when you're out in the open and you're feeling that kind of tropical heat. So yeah, an umbrella, doesn't have to be a massive one, but a reasonably sturdy kind of travel umbrella. Yeah, that's the best thing I've taken, which is not standard.
I like the idea and concept. And I know, for example, a lot of PCT hikers will bring an umbrella. And on the PCT, they might only get a few days of rain the entire 5 months. But they do get a ton of sunshine, and it really helps protect them from that. And when I did the Colorado Trail last summer. And when I did that, there were a lot of people carrying umbrellas, and it did rain a fair amount. I'm someone who always has trekking poles. I found it hard to figure out how to actually manage with an umbrella. You've got to put 2 poles in one hand or hold it, or they have these little devices that allow you to attach it to the front of your pack, but it never seemed to work exactly right. I have mixed feelings about whether an umbrella is the right solution for me, but I do think I was actually a little envious at times when it started pouring on us and I saw other people all opening their umbrellas.
Yeah, I'm with you. I haven't tried the attaching it to a pack. I agree. It's a bit tricky. You've got I always use hiking poles as well, and I would have 2 in one hand and the brolly out.
Okay.
I mean, it works if the terrain is fine. It works well. Obviously, if you're trying to do quite rough terrain or tree roots or stuff like that, it gets a bit too much to handle. So then just the raincoat, I'd use that. But certainly for the weight versus the benefit you get, again, it depends really if you think about the hike you do. But if the terrain underfoot, you can walk without poles for sections at least, then yeah, I'd definitely take an umbrella.
All right. What's the one hike or trip that you've done besides this one that others shouldn't miss out on?
So it's called the Kanchenjunga Circuit, which I walked November 2022, and it was again with the mountain company. And this is in far east Nepal, so it's on the border with India. So Kanchenjunga is the 3rd largest or highest mountain in the world. They actually thought it was the highest mountain in the world until they discovered Everest and K2. And it's quite unusual because something like Everest, you've got Lhotse, which is the 4th highest mountain, which is like next door. And it's a whole range of very tall mountains. Whereas Kanchenjunga is just a massive mountain by itself, effectively. And there's a trip called the circuit, and basically you can't go all the way around because there's the border between Nepal and India, but you sort of go 3/4 of the way around, then you kind of come back and do the other bit. And it's probably one of the most varied hikes in Nepal. They start off in kind of tropical, jungly, almost environment, and then you head up through altitude and you get lots of different kind of scenery, and then you end up into full-on alpine, and it's quite spectacular. There are guest houses along the way. I believe you do need to have, or technically you should have a guide to do it. You need a permit. And some of the areas in Nepal where you need permits to kind of hike in those areas, and they're trying to restrain the number of people doing it, but there's a fair amount of hiking infrastructure there. And so the weather was really, we did it in November, there was no rain, blue skies every day, very nice. There was better infrastructure. It's a lot cheaper than hiking in Bhutan. But I think looking back on it, and I've actually done a blog post comparing the two, the Snowman had better scenery and you felt more that kind of wilderness remoteness feel, and there was more kind of culture. The Kanchenjunga was more like 3 to 3.5 weeks. So it was a little bit shorter than the Snowman. But the scenery on that was phenomenal and just a really good, if you like big hikes at altitude, that's a really good one.
Yeah, I like the idea of this one because there's so many big popular treks in Nepal, like Everest Base Camp, like Annapurna, but there's so many other interesting big treks there that people aren't that familiar with. So it's good to learn about those. I definitely want to go back and do more treks in Nepal. And I'm not one that really likes to do, if I can help it, the really, really popular ones. Although, I mean, I've done some other really popular ones like the Tour de Mont Blanc and things like that. But they're great and they're popular for a reason. But it's nice to find ones that are a little bit less well known that are equally beautiful.
I found some great stats on the Nepalese tourism website or something, which had a pie chart breaking down the proportion of visitors to Nepal that went to different regions of Nepal. And from memory, something like 60% of all visitors went to the Annapurna region, and 20% went to the Everest region, and then there was 8% to the Mustang region, and Kanchenjunga was like 3%. And so it was like very small numbers in comparison, but it was still amazing how much infrastructure there was. So the trip that the mountain company run there is a camping trip, but there are actually guest houses the whole way. So you could very easily, if you hired your own guide and some porters, you can sleep in a guest house every spot along the way. And it's interesting, actually, the hikes in Nepal every year, they get shorter by a day or two because the roads come in.
Road building
In Nepal is a lot.
Yeah.
But the Snowman Trek hasn't changed in years. Like the Snowman is a snowman. Okay. It hasn't had that same effect there because, I mean, it's going into the mountains areas where there's kind of less people. But certainly in Nepal, you have to be aware that, I mean, like the classic Annapurna is a road all the way around. So that's why they developed these kind of alternative Annapurnas. So it's always a race against time and itineraries for doing treks to get away from the roads in Nepal. That's one of the challenges.
All right, last question. What's the next trip on your list?
So my next big trip is to do the Ladakh Sky Trail, again with the mountain company, and that will be August this year. So Ladakh is northern India. It's the Himalayan part of India. And it's very culturally similar, actually, to Bhutan and Tibet in terms of the Buddhism. And they've got beautiful monasteries and temples up there. And in Bhutan, they're quite, you can't take photos inside the monastery. Like they're quite strict and about etiquette and things. Whereas in Ladakh, it's a more kind of accessible and some stunning kind of spaces up there. So we're doing this trip it's 23-day trip, 18 days of hiking. It's another high one. So Ladakh is high. There's 7 passes over 4,500 meters. The highest point is actually higher than the highest point or about the same height as on the Snowman. But it's at the western end of the Himalaya. So it's very dry climate. There's very few trees. Like it's the complete opposite. So in Snowman, very forested in Bhutan, whereas the Ladakh is, you can't see a tree basically. It's just so you get these amazing colored rocks and landscapes. And so it'll be quite a different kind of feel, I hope, from what I've done in Nepal and Bhutan.
That sounds great. I've heard great things about Ladakh and the Buddhism history there. The culture sounds really fascinating. But I've also heard about literally within the last year, border skirmishes between India and China there. I know, like literally with, violence. So I'm sure the mountain company's on top of it and will make sure you are going in a place that is safe at a time that is safe. But it's interesting that is still an area that's a little bit of a hot spot.
It is. And actually, so I've been to Leh, which is the sort of capital of Ladakh before, and that was an overland trip. So I went overland from Delhi to Leh and sort of get the train and go to Shimla and where the home of the Dalai Lama. And then there's this kind of classic, a lot of Indians on motorbikes will do this trip, which is from Manali up to Leh. And it's a spectacular piece of road and amazing kind of scenery. But they were building a big tunnel when I did it. And that was so they can get the Indian army to the border quicker because the Chinese have got much better infrastructure and roading on their side, so they can bring the reinforcements in. Whereas the Indians, it's quite hard to get up there. And I remember being up, so even further remote from Leh is a place called the Nubra Valley, which is beautiful, beautiful, beautiful place. And I remember seeing this massive, it wasn't a Hercules, it's like, they've got the Hercules transport planes. The one that looks like a Hercules, but it's like twice the size. It's like, is it a Galaxy or something? There's like, some quite big US military kind of transport jets flying around. And you're like, I wasn't expecting to see this here, but because it's close to the border, there is a lot of military equipment up there. And the airport in Leh is basically an Indian Air Force airport, which happens to run commercial flights in and out of it. So there's definitely a bit of a vibe. I mean, when they did have that border skirmish, they were throwing rocks at each other. Like, it's not... Right.
I actually heard they were like... There was a limit they put on themselves because if they actually start firing bullets, it's a whole separate level of escalation. So I think that's why they were throwing rocks.
Correct.
Once you pull the trigger, it's hard to reverse that.
Correct.
Anyway, I don't want to leave it at that. I think Ladakh is going to be fantastic. And like you said, you've been there before and you know how wonderful it is. So I wish you the best of luck. I think it's going to be a great trip. And I'm actually interested to hear about that when you get back from it. But Jonty Crane, thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate you coming to talk about the Snowman Trek.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thanks again to Jonty Crane for coming on the show. And I hope that we've inspired you to hike the Snowman Trek. Or if that seems like a bit much, look into one of the shorter treks in Bhutan that go through the same region. Or just visit Bhutan for the cultural experience, which seems like it should be amazing. I certainly hope to visit someday. And I'll put in a little plug here for our Trails with Hiking adventures. If Bhutan is cost prohibitive for you, why not join me in Nepal in October 2026 to hike the Annapurna Base Camp route, also known as the Annapurna Sanctuary Trek. It's not as extreme and more traveled, as Jonty noted, that region of Nepal at least. But it's also beautiful and popular for a reason. We have several listeners already signed up for the trip, but we have room for a few more. And I'd love it if you came along and joined me and friend of the show, Tony Wong, on this fantastic hike, where you can spend a couple of weeks hiking in the Himalayas with fellow Trails Worth Hiking listeners. If you'd like to join us, reach out to Earthbound Expeditions, the trekking company in Nepal that we're using, at earthboundnpl@gmail.com, so earthboundnepal@gmail.com, and let them know you want to join the October 2026 Trails Worth Hiking trek to Annapurna Base Camp. Or you can simply email me at trailsworthhiking@gmail.com and I can connect you with them or answer any questions that you have. You just need to put down a deposit to hold your spot so that you too can experience the wonders of the Himalayas and the fantastic people of Nepal. I'm so looking forward to going back to Nepal, and someday I will get to Bhutan too, if I'm lucky. If you've enjoyed this episode, tell a friend about it, or better yet, give us a good review on whichever podcast service you use. And keep in mind that this podcast is entertainment and meant to spark your interest. If you decide to hike the trail, do your own research. Like anything else worth doing, outdoor adventure has risk. So when you go, pack your common sense. And when you get back, tell me how it went. Next time on Trails Worth Hiking, we come back to the United States, to the American West, to hike a roughly 40-mile route that has stunning alpine scenery, rugged peaks, glacial lakes, and wildflower meadows, as we hike along the spine of one of America's most iconic mountain ranges. Join me next time as we hike the Teton Crest Trail in Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming. If you have any questions or feedback on this episode, or ideas for future episodes, including if you want to be a guest and talk about a trail you've hiked, reach out to me at trailsworthhiking@gmail.com. I have lots of great episodes in the queue, by the way, but please do continue to reach out. And if we've talked before about doing an episode and not connected again to schedule it, reach out again. I really don't mind and do appreciate the reminders. And if I've said I was interested in doing an episode, I really am. It's just that I get very far behind in getting these all produced and released. But we'll get there eventually. And the more often you reach back out to me, the more likely I am to get your episode scheduled. All right, so start planning your next hike, and before you know it, you'll be on the trail. Thanks for listening.